Good evening. My name is Maggie Maston, and I'm a student project manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many indigenous peoples that lived at these lands, as well as the thousands of indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School starting in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clark Forum, Dickinson College, and the Department of Religion, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, The World as We Would Have It Be, Collective Thriving in the Timeplace of Collapse. At this time, I ask that you please silence all cell phones and other devices. In the case of an emergency, accessible exits are located through the doors behind me. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until then. And we ask that you please keep questions succinct so that everyone who wants to has a chance to ask theirs. As a show of respect for our speakers and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. Last year, I had the privilege of taking a religion class with Professor Schlechter, and it sparked my personal interest in this subject. Taking his class was eye-opening because not only did it help me to move past just studying religion in an academic manner, but it helped me to see how religion shapes the identity and lifestyles of people around the world. So thank you, Professor Schlechter. I have carried the lessons from your class with me every day since, and it has deepened my appreciation for voices like those we'll hear from tonight. Norma Wong is an 86th generation Zen Master of the Rinzai Zen line. She's lived her entire life in Hawaii and spent over 30 years in electoral politics. She has served as an advisor and staff member to a former Hawaii governor on Native Hawaiian and federal issues. She has extensive experience directly applying Zen and indigenous values and practices to controversial issues, facilitating transformational change and breakthrough. She's a thought partner, teacher, and author. Her most recent book was released in February and is titled Who We Are Becoming Matters: The Courage, Wisdom, and Aloha We Need in a Timeplace of Collapse. David McMahan is the Charles A. Dana Professor of Religious Studies at Franklin and Marshall College. He has spent much of his work focusing on Mahayana Buddhism in South Asia and the modern world. He is the author of several books, including Rethinking Meditation, Buddhist Meditative Practices in Ancient and Modern Worlds, and it was published in 2023. His expertise covers Buddhism and modernity, such as its interactions with science and psychology. More recently, he has been studying the various ways in which Buddhist and Buddhist-derived meditation are understood and practiced in different cultural and historical contexts. And now, please join me in welcoming our speakers, Norma Wong and David McMahan.
Thank you.
Good evening. Aloha, aloha kako. As a person of indigenous ancestry, I want to acknowledge the people of this place who I have not had an opportunity to long sojourn with, but for whom I feel as I walk into this environment so far from my home, in a place that is foreign to me. Foreign because I had to wear all of my clothes at the same time in order to traverse a single day. And it is clear to me that the people of this place were hardy and that you are hardy. You are the people who choose to be with the different seasons that would not be present in the place of my home, of Hawaii, and that you would carry that forth day to day, week to week, month to month, and that you would depict people who would understand a place such as this. So I just want to acknowledge that there are different ways at which you can do land acknowledgements. My preference is to basically acknowledge my ancestors from where I came and to greet the descendants of the people who are here. Even if you're not the direct descendants, you are now the people who steward this place. So thank you so much for that. David and I were talking about who our ancestors are and why that would even be important in modern times to talk about your ancestors. So, right.
Thank you. Yes, and thanks to everybody at the Clark Forum who's been very generous, and we've just had a really good time being here over the last day. And we were brought together in conversation because we have overlapping interests from very different angles. Norma is a Zen teacher, and I'm a scholar of Buddhism and sort of bad practitioner. I mean, I have experience with meditation for many years, and when people hear me say that, they're like, "Oh, well, you must have really learned something." I was like, I don't know. I'm kind of bad at it, but I've been sort of experimenting on the ground a bit with Buddhist meditation for a long time, and I got very interested in it from an academic perspective, mainly because I just wanted to do something interesting with my life, and I was very interested in exploring various worldviews when the one that I grew up with kind of fell apart for me very young. And so I began wandering bookstores and picking up books in philosophy and religion off the shelves. And at some point, it occurred to me I might actually be able to make a living doing this. And I just feel like I've gotten away with some kind of funny crime. It's been really nice. Because my work intersects not only with scholars, but also with teachers like Norma. I've interviewed people and spent time with people in many different traditions in Asia, as well as America, and I'm really interested in how religious traditions, particularly Buddhism, the one I study, transform and adapt to very different conditions that we have here in the modern world. And I'm learning, as Norma and I have gotten to know each other, that you're a great example of that, because I think you described yourself as a kind of rogue.
I am a rogue. I am or in natural terms, I'm a wild variant, basically. And I have an inquiry about the role of wild variants in long pathways. Even though Buddhism is not theistic, it actually makes a very poor religion if you are inclined in that direction. If you take up Buddhism, there's such a wide variety of ways in which you can practice, and no one's going to scold you, because it has this way in which it has elasticity. It's become many forms throughout its history. And I would say, the reason I would say it makes a poor religion is because there is nothing to believe in Buddhism. There's just really no thing, right? No external aspect of it. In some ways, I would say that it is built as a practice to how it is you can actually figure out more about who it is that you are, and that humanity is, and that the world is about. And it's just about an unfolding of that. And David and I are not quite sure why we got brought in to be the speakers at the same time. And I am sitting here figuring that out. And a thing that I believe is like a crossover here is that what does a modern inquiry of a long spiritual path mean for this particular moment in human history? What does that mean, right? Like, what is that calling to, and what does the unfolding of that offer to humanity, even the part of humanity that is not particularly observant of any particular belief or involved in any practice. You know, David said he believes himself to be a poor practitioner. And I would say that makes up about 75 or 80% of people who are Buddhist practitioners. So it's like we have such a wide variety of ways in which practice can occur. And so at this moment that feels a little tense and dangerous, at this moment that feels that there is so much that is not working, more that is not working than is working, the more where we're trying to figure out who it is that we are and what our intent is, not only as a country, but as humans. What is it that you are inquiring about, and what is it that I'm inquiring about, have to offer for this? And so I think possibly that's why we were put on the same stage together. But we'll just go with that.
Yeah. Well, so, you know, one thing, maybe we can start with this idea, which we touched on earlier at lunch, that is contrary probably to popular understanding in the West. Buddhism has often been a very collective endeavor. It's not just about individuals going into their own minds and going off in a cave and meditating, and that happens. But I think modernity has ushered in a sense of increased individualism that in some ways has brought some good things. We wouldn't have individual human rights, we wouldn't have women's rights and various, we wouldn't have the idea that we should all have kind of the same rights if we didn't have some focus on the individual. So I don't want to dismiss it altogether. But it has come with a cost. And the cost sometimes is, I hear people say, well, why are you doing this or that or joining the book club or everything? Well, I want community. And I think we noted earlier that people only talk like that about community once community has been shattered, right? We don't have natural communities nearly as much anymore. We didn't really think about, well, who are my people, who are my friends, who are, these things for most of human history just kind of happened naturally. You were around a bunch of people and you kind of all had your roles and you dealt with each other. And so this kind of purely individualistic striving, I think, is part of the kind of modern malaise. I know and I feel like it engenders in people strange relationships with themselves. You've probably heard this. This is like modern American Buddhist lore now. But there was a talk that the Dalai Lama gave once, and afterwards somebody asked him in the question and answer session about the problem of self-hatred, and he said, "What?" And his self-hatred, and he said, "What?" And he's consulting with his translator, and finally his translator kind of explains to him, "Yeah, this is a thing." And he was really kind of shocked and horrified. And I don't think that's necessarily because he's in some kind of, blissful state all the time. He himself says, I'm an ordinary person, I get angry and everything. But I think it's because we've generated a kind of special self-hatred in the modern world because we feel like we're on our own, and it's up to us to sort of create ourselves. And Buddhism has a practice where it's a meditation practice actually, where you start with sort of feeling a sense of loving kindness and compassion toward yourself, and then you kind of extend that outward to somebody you really like, and then somebody who's kind of neutral, and then somebody you don't really like. But the basis of that is you have to have that. And I think his idea was people just have that naturally, right? And the idea that they didn't was very disappointing and dismaying, I think.
It would help to explain many things, though,
Yeah.
right? It would help to explain many behavioral things that happen in modern times, not only in communities, but in countries, and right now between countries, right? Where there would be very distinctively, there's me, myself, and I, and then there are other people. And the other people we may be in relationship with or not. And then there's a way in which we would say there's us, and then there are others. So even when we think of the we think of we as being people who are identified in a particular way, or people of a nationality, or people who would value a particular political perspective, right? And then there's more and more of this way in which we go into our warring camps of things. And from both an indigenous perspective as well as a Buddhist perspective, that would be unnatural. It's an unnatural thing to think about us as being separated from each other, right? But we also understand that the reason you would practice is because over the course of your life, you would begin to build these ways in which you would sharply identify yourself in a particular way and separate yourself from what would be more natural, right? That as a baby, you're born whole, and you would greet any being, whether it is human or not. You'd greet the family dog as a relative, as a baby, right? You wouldn't have this notion, for example, that the family dog was not your kin, right? You would just have that. And at some point, someone would explain to you, and you would then go, oh, these are animals, and then these are humans. Or then these are humans that are my family, and these are humans that are not my family. And then these are humans who believe with the same things I believe, and these are humans that don't believe the same thing I believe. And then you would just separate more and more and more. And then there's the accumulation effect of that, which is, I think, many of us, our ancestors lived more communally. And then we somehow thought that progress meant that we would have our own home, and we move away from home, we have our own lives, and all of that. And some of that is just about modernity, where that's happened all across the globe. The Japanese, who are very communal, have a huge problem with loneliness right now, because what progress has meant is that people would live more individually. And what has arisen is this huge, the difference is they consider loneliness to be a national problem. And we don't consider loneliness to be a national problem. So that's they still have that yearning for the communal way, and they recognize that loneliness is a national issue. So, it's that returning back to be in good relationship, in relationship where people that you have met really for the first time, that you would have an instant sense whether you could count on them if there is a problem. And I would bet that all of you would recognize that to be the case, even if you didn't have a practice around it. So in Hawaii, we have periodic natural disasters. We would have a tsunami, a way in which we would have a flood or a hurricane, or we don't wish it on ourselves, but we might have a wildfire in which at Lahaina, right, over 100 people would perish. But what would happen during the disaster and right after that is that there would be this coming together of people, almost as if that were the natural thing to happen. And we are lucky enough in Hawaii to still have a muscle that we exercise when we're not having disasters. Okay, so a very common anniversary that we celebrate is, there are two things. One is a baby's first birthday and a high school graduation. we actually don't care if you graduate from college. So you might have graduated, with high honors. You might be the valedictorian from an Ivy League college. But what we really want to know is what high school did you graduate from, and whether that was celebrated or not. I think, there's probably a story behind that, but whatever. So those would be two big celebrations. And if you have less than 100 people that come to one of those, you would be considered someone who is, oh, so sorry, their community is small, right? They would, and in fact, there have been instances where people would invite people that are not necessarily close, but are close to somebody, where you would bring your friends, their close friends, to someone that would be the first time that you would meet, because it would be shameful to have a baby's birthday that only has 100 people, right? And, but that would not be the beginning or the end of it. There would be a way in which that birthday would have been produced by the community, not just by the hosts. So people would come together, they would cook for several days in order to make the foods that everybody wanted to have. And that would mean there would be the party before the party, and then the party after everything is cleaned up. And then it's shameful if everyone doesn't have something to take home, right? And so you would make more. If you run out of food, it would be a horrible thing, right? A horrible thing. If you just served appetizers, they would talk about you for months as it being a terrible thing, right? And so we'd have a standard of the way in which we would practice being in community that would mean that horrifically, if there's a wildfire, that everyone would come immediately, and we would come before government can come. We would begin to assist each other before any agency would be on the ground, right? We would be the people who would tell the agency, this is what is needed, right? We would be the interface for that. We would come together, right? And it really feels that that muscle needs to be rebuilt, not only in places like Hawaii, which still have that muscle, but really across many, many communities and across the globe.
So yeah, maybe the challenge then is in our era to reimagine how that level of integrated community can happen without the kind of tribalism that's often associated with it, and also without the kind of internal sort of caste system that's often associated with it. You know, when you look at close-knit communities, they can be oppressive, they can be stifling. And so it's difficult to imagine kind of open-ended, democratic, non-hierarchical communities that are still, that are opt-in communities. They're not going to be natural communities almost now. It's almost impossible. People move around and they're displaced in various ways. So yeah, I think we're still in the process of trying to reimagine what community can be right now.
I do believe that that's the case. I see that the difficulties of the time, the human-made difficulties of the time, the economic situations, the political strife, the way in which we are not sure on a given day whether in the morning, whether we will see in the news that we are at war or not. That these types of conditions essentially are building a new condition for us to rebuild our relationship with each other, right? It's like, it's the irony, right, is the helpfulness of collapse. Because if things are sort of limping along well enough, even though we have gripes about it, there's no reason for us to reach across the taboo barriers, right, of whether or not these people who, don't look like me, who vote differently than I do, whether these are the people that I will throw in my lot with, right? So it's like the collapse in some ways is useful. It's like the threshold in which much bigger shifts can occur, right? And then it's up to us to not repeat, right, the unhelpful ways that we have both more tentatively, transactionally been in relationship. Okay, I'll be helpful to you if you're helpful to me. That type of stuff, right? Where we're in transaction to each other. So the irony of all of this is that this moment, which I believe will be a long moment, this is not about whether the next couple of years are going to be hard, right? We're going to be in a long moment. Part of this is just the earth itself, right, is going through a long moment, and it's putting a strain on all of the human systems that were set up to deal with different circumstances, right? So even beneficial governments or beneficial institutions are having difficulty producing into that, like the beneficial means, right? And so we could hold together each other like, the analogy that would come to mind is I live in a place where termites are present a lot. Hawaii is just that, it's in that tropical zone where there are lots of termites. And we also like to live in homes that are made with wood. We're really chancing it by doing that. Okay, and so if you live in a really old house, what you basically say is, we're so lucky the termites are holding each other's hands, holding up our house. Okay, so will we be the termites holding on to each other's hands to hold on to the house that's crumbling around us? Or will we take a chance and actually move forward and build a different kind of house? Right? Will we do that? I'm hopeful about that. I feel good about our chances that is something that we will do.
But you do think that a collapse is going to happen first?
I do believe a collapse has already started, that we're in the middle of, and that the only thing that is keeping us from acknowledging that is that, among other things, we live in a country that is actually very abundant. And so even these things that are crumbling still have a lot to offer, and have a lot of margin, and all of that. So you'd say we have pantries that are relatively full. Even the poorest among us in this country would be shocked about the conditions of the poor in other places, right? And literally would not survive. The poorest among us would not survive in the places where poor exist in other places, right? And so all of that is sort of artificially holding us. We are already in that long collapse. Like a way that I know collapse is occurring is many of our ideas are no longer big ideas. They're small, marginal ideas that are hoping to just hold things together, which is a thing that you do, right? When you're essentially in a state where there isn't open ground anymore, right? And so in many ways, it's like this. Oh, and by the way, it started before I was born, and I just turned 70, right? So this is not. I don't think it's like a sudden phenomena. it's suddenly we understand that this is a thing that is occurring. But we have a long history as humans going through difficult times, right? I recently read about humans being in community, having some form of governance, having language, not written language, but having language and ways and cultural types of practices. At the end of the last ice age, okay, all right, that long ago, right? And at the end of the last ice age, where they could not fathom that there would be a world that would not be covered by ice, like an entire world covered by ice. And that they would then decide that a thing that they would need to do is they would need to move to all of the high places where that would be higher than the highest rise of the water, right? And they would move that in advance of the rise of the water, right? Because they would move all of they didn't flee, they moved ahead of the rise of the water, okay? And they established themselves. And how do we know that to be so? It's because they then passed down the stories of that from one generation to another, right? One generation to another generation, for more generations than we have the capacity to hold, right? As being the wingspan of our knowledge, right? And then it would be a legend. And then modern scientists would go to that place and they go, oh, yes, that's what happened. And the indigenous people would go, well, I mean, yeah, right? Yeah, that's the story that came down to us. And then the question is, why was it important for that particular story to come down to us of all the stories, right? And perhaps it was for us in modern times to know, our ancestors have done this before. And perhaps we just improved our lives too much to know what it would mean to have to go and do this again. But our ancestors have done this before. And now we should have more means to be able to do that. Hopefully we have not forgotten our spirit possibilities to be able to do that.
Yeah, and I think that, it reminds me of a kind of tension, a creative tension within a lot of, I think all the Buddhist traditions really, between a sort of interior cultivation of wisdom and that big picture perspective that you're talking about, and that can be comforting. Like, it's not just about this generation, it's about many generations, and it's not just about what's happening right here and right now and next couple days, but it's about a very wide picture. And at various times, the Buddhist tradition has also said we don't want to lose ourselves just in a kind of passivity of that kind of big, wide perspective too, because there are people right here and now who are suffering. And I spend a lot of my time with 18 to 22-year-olds, and it's a tougher sell to somebody who's 22 right now and entering a terrible job market, entering a time of just, you've only lived in that time of political turmoil, but for us, this is an unusually insane time, and I think it's worth just acknowledging the insanity of what's in the paper right now, today, that we have a leader who's threatening to, I think, I'm sort of quoting, obliterate a civilization. And, for young people to come into this world and say, wow, okay, what do I do with this? That's something I feel on a daily basis, practically. So I think, short-term strategies as well as that long-term perspective, and bringing those two things together are really important, because if you just get lost in the, what's happening today and tomorrow, it can drive you crazy. And if you just get lost in the very vast kind of cosmic perspective, you can become too passive, especially if you're comfortable, if you have enough to eat. So I don't know, how do we bring those two together?
Well, that's the assignment.
Yeah.
Right? The assignment
We have how long?
Well, the assignment really, which by the way, from Indigenous perspective, it would not be unusual from Indigenous perspective to have to take care of all the things right now, because otherwise you wouldn't make it to the next winter, right? But also to have a notion, what would my descendants need to do? And we have, someone would basically say, my descendants would need to be able to span the Susquehanna River. And so therefore, we need to be able to figure out how we're going to do that. But right now, we can't cross the river, right? We don't have the technology for it. We don't have the means for it. So we have maybe 3 generations, 60 years, to figure out how to cross the river. And they would think nothing, right, of the notion that we have the assignment for day and we have the assignment for the future. By the way, it would be all of our ancestors as represented in this room, because if you cannot call yourself Indigenous today, it's only because your peoples got separated from their indigeneity too long ago for that. It was like a couple thousand years ago or 1,500 years ago rather than 200 or 300 years ago, right? That's all that it means. But they would be the people of that place who would have a relationship to that place and would have a relationship to ancestors and would have a relationship to descendants who are not yet born. And they would not have the same linear notion about time-space as we have today. They would really say, okay, we have things we need to do today, and we need to have a clear eye about what our people are going to need in the future, and what is our generation's assignment in making that happen. They wouldn't call it a strategy or a plan, but that's essentially what they would be doing. And they would be doing it as peoples as a whole, not by virtue of only the leaders, right? It wouldn't be your differentiation might be by expertise, as in I am the knot maker, and you are the one who knows how to catch fish, right? And you're the one who knows how to find the bark that will be edible at certain times of the year, and your job is to pass that knowledge on, right? So you might have like specialties, but everyone would be concerned, right? How long would it take me to learn a new way to tie a knot so that we could build a vessel that would cross the river? And and then the person who is, how long will we have to be able to eat this bark before we actually have to move because we will have eaten all the bark, right? And so therefore we have, and then how do we triangulate that? And they would have those types of conversations. How do we know that's true? Because otherwise we wouldn't be here, right? They would not have carried out the assignment that would allow us to survive as humans. It wouldn't. It could not if we had at the earliest stages of our lives being so tribal that small groups of people, right, would only think of their own survival, right? If that were the case, we literally would not have survived, okay? So therefore, right, what does this mean in modernity, that we would now do this in modernity, right? And which is not about, let's all go back to the old ways. I like my hot water, thank you very much. And I don't want to be gathering fuel for a week for the bath that I would take once a week, right? So this isn't about that, right? It isn't about that. But it is about essentially like the crossing over. It's like, tribalism. So Native people is basically every time that word is used, there's a little bit of a cringe, because as indigenous peoples in a country, you have been officially, legally designated as tribes. So what does that mean now that we would say tribalism and we would have like let's not do that, right? I mean, there's that kind of a rub kind of a thing. And I think that what that does point to, though, is like as an indigenous person, I know that that in modern times, what we as indigenous people have to do is we can't just think of ourselves as the Native Hawaiians, as the Cherokee, as the Inuit, as the Navajo, as, right? We just can't think of it ourselves as separate tribes. We do have to say, well, as the most recent indigenous people who have been separated from indigeneity, we might still have some muscle in our ways that would be useful for all humankind, okay? And that's why we have been, by circumstances and by luck, still in existence, because we are now called upon to be of that usefulness to humanity generally, right? Like that would be a thing, right? So, it's the kind of thing I think about once in a while when I take my shower or I cook my food, right? We're geeks, so we think about things like that.
So maybe we should brainstorm things that are our assignment that aren't obvious. I mean, there are obvious things that need to happen. We need to address climate change somehow, even though nobody's talking about it anymore. That seems to be the foundational thing. And I guess one of the things about being geeks is we think about ideas, and probably especially as a scholar in the humanities, we probably put too much emphasis and too much power on how much an idea can really change something. But this topic came up in my class recently. If we see something like climate change as a kind of technical matter, I mean, it is that. There's no doubt about it. We need to do certain physical things in order for the climate not to just spin out of control, and we need scientists and people working on the tech to make this work. But the thing is, we know all that already. We know all those things. We know how to solve the problem, and yet we're not doing it. That's the interesting thing. So I do feel like there needs to be a reconceiving of nature in some way. So we were talking about this in a talk that I gave recently at another place, through this metaphor in the Buddhist tradition of Indra's net, which is you have it in a few ancient texts, this image of a gigantic net, and it goes out infinitely into space, and at each juncture of the net is a jewel or a kind of reflecting, it's a jewel. And so if you look at the jewel, you see every other jewel in that one jewel, and that jewel is also reflected in everyone else. And so when people hear that, there's kind of like, oh yeah, that makes a kind of sense today, that maybe it didn't even make a couple, 100 centuries ago when it was, first put out there, because we live in such an interconnected world, and we realize that, what happens in this part of the world affects the other parts of the world, and we have communications networks where we can talk to somebody on the other side of the world, and we know that our actions are no longer separate. They're reverberating everywhere. And so that's a new phenomenon. that all of a sudden a sort of ancient image has been repurposed to address. And in a way, I think people use an idea, an image, a metaphor like that to kind of work their way into re-sacralizing the world. Because another part of the story of the atomistic individual in modernity is that we think of the individual as kind of where everything is happening, and then the world out there is just sort of matter. It's just like dead stuff, and we can do whatever we want to it, and it's not really going to affect what's important. And we now know that's not a workable way to think about it. So I do think these ideas matter, and so maybe people writing books and talking about, sort of suggesting things, and I think certainly the indigenous traditions have had a very different conception of nature and of matter and the world and our relationship to it. And again, it's not necessarily that we're going to just bring those back unaltered, but I think they can be sort of reinterpreted in a modern sense to give people a sense of meaning in the natural world, and that can be used to mobilize people and mobilize public opinion to actually do the technical stuff that needs to be done.
There's some things that are really big lifts that will require not only a lot of people, but require things that are more institutional, right? So, and then there's the things that we can just do for each other. And I believe that the way we're currently trending, that it won't be long. So in the next, within the next 18 to 24 months, as much as 25% of the people living in this country will need some support with food on a more regular basis, okay? And it could be a little bit or it could be a lot, but it will be a much more significant, and it doesn't mean they're going to qualify for anything, right? They're just going to need some help with the food. And so what does that mean if there's like one set of things, which is we're going to require some kind of a system to deliver that. And what we're going to use all of our collective power to do is to try to get the system to do that. Or the other thing we could do is just pay attention to our neighbors and share. And if we pay attention to our neighbors and we share and we do this with our neighbors rather than for our neighbors, we begin to alter the possibilities of not only how we're in relationship to them, but also how places that have a lot of people might be able to begin to make this moment that seems difficult less difficult. Just ease it up a little bit. And why would easing up be important? If we don't ease up, I think we'll forget that we have agency as people, and we will forget the simple satisfaction of being able to do something. We'll fall more and more into this notion that it's hopeless, right? And when hope leaves the room, so much air leaves the room, right? And when air leaves the room, you could feel everybody's spirit meter, kind of like move down. I'm watching, like, what does the flux capacitor say in terms of our spirit existence? And I think of spirit existence as being important irrespective of whether you believe in anything. Yeah. Will we as beings like feel like possibility is ours to do, and to do it in really concrete ways. And I can't think of anything more concrete than offering food and receiving food, and making food together and eating together and sharing together. and and sharing the recipe that that only you know about, as far as you know of, until you go and actually read it in a recipe book and realize that was what's passed down to you, was actually something that was in a recipe book. But you'll set the recipe book aside anyway, because what was important is that it was passed down to you, right? And to do this. And to me, that's not a big notion. That's not like a futuristic kind of a thing. By the way, the need is upon us. So by doing that, right, it fulfills something immediate. In Hawaii, we are between 2,300 and 2,600 miles from anything. No one can get to us shorter than 4.5 hours. That's the shortest that anyone can get to us, because there isn't a teleporting yet. Okay, so the shortest someone can get to us is in 4.5 hours, and so therefore, what has long been, I mean, like before my mother was born, there's already, you need to have 14 days of supplies. Every household needs to have 14 days of supplies for the people within that household. And then what we know is not everybody will do that. But if you at least have a third of the households who do that, and do it with some discipline, then when there is an emergency, there will be things that we can share with each other. And if we can share it with each other, then the government actually won't have to supply everything to everybody, right? And if the government doesn't have to supply everything to everybody, then they can actually do more things, right, if they don't have to do that. And so like there's this way in which you would be entangled, right, by this. By the way, it's like you may not be able to tell because, we're in conversation here, I'm in conversation, but I'm an introvert. So what that means is I've long lived in my neighborhood and I don't know the names of my neighbors unless they've offered their name. Because as an introvert, if I said, "And what is your name?" I would be filled with anxiety and I would have to go into my meditative breathing to calm myself down, right? So I literally have people that I have been in relationship with for more than 15 years whose names I don't know, but who I actually know quite intimately, which is to say that, I know that they have grandchildren that sometimes need to use their house for their graduation parties, and they will come over and they will say to me, "I promise we shut it down at 10 p.m., shut it down. Not a minute later, shut it down. And you are invited to come, even though I know you don't like to come." Right? They know me. They know I'm an introvert. You don't like to come, but if you smell something that is delicious, that you would like to have, just, let's see, oh, I know, just hang your red t-shirt on your porch, and I will see your red t-shirt, and I will come and I will bring something for you, right? So it's like they know me, but they also know me in ways that, and I don't think they know my name, and I don't know their name, but we nonetheless, right, know each other, right? Whether we can do that in increasingly larger circles, I think it matters right now. It's like, and that's in the here and now. It matters in the here and now. It matters that after the tsunami in Japan, and they knew that the tsunami would be so big, the earthquake of the tsunami would be so big that it would move across the Pacific and that Hawaii would be impacted, that people in Japan who are students, hula students, dance students of teachers in Hawaii called their teachers to say, "The wave is coming. Please go to high ground. that they would do that, even though they're dealing with the devastation that is right in their backyard, that they would do that. And that immediately that Hawaii people would be gathering resources to send to Japan because of the devastation that would be there, right? These things, like, they matter, and they matter more right now. And I believe that that may be like the building block for some new possibility for us, right? So I have hope. I have hope about that. Right. I'm wondering whether people might have questions for us.
Yeah, yeah. Sure, yeah. Let's do that.
It is now time for the question and answer session. Because this event is being recorded, if you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you before asking it. We reserve the first question for students, and then we will open it up to everyone else. We will now take the first question.
Is this on? Yep. Hello, thank you both so much. This was a really, really interesting talk. My question is actually going to focus a little bit more on the application side of it, the constructive side of it that you both talked about. And I know that we've talked about government not being super effective at the moment, but is there a way to use the law and government in a way that can foster the kind of community that you both talked about?
Are you familiar with the concept in technology called a hack? Okay. I think that we're in a moment where that needs to be the principle that we have in relationship with government. So rather than thinking about it as, oh, we need to reform government, that we think about it as a hack. What are the hacks in which government might be able to release resources and authorities and powers and things like that, that would be in more useful arrangement with people's needs. And we have to understand, because it's a hack, that we actually have to stand up ways in which community does part of it, right? So we don't just say, oh, this is what we want, and then you government, you provide. We say, no, government, what you need to do is to make it easier for something to happen. This happened in Hawaii with a houseless community. It was really a community. So what they didn't have is they didn't have homes. But otherwise, this was a group of people that had long taken care of each other. And so what she said to the government is, when we move out of these makeshift shelters, we don't want to be scattered as individuals into different kinds of transitional housing according to your programs. We want to move together, right? We want to move together. And there's some people who will give us some land in which we can go and build together. But what we would be needing to do would be against every permit, right? Every regulation, every planning process that the state and the county would permit, right? And so we need government basically to help provide the authority that would allow us to do this. And then can we work together to deal with, well, if you need fire regulations, does it have to be handled only in this way, right? Can it be done in these other ways? And who are the people who would be able to provide expertise into that? Can we find that in different parts of community or in government, right? And so a community of almost 200 people are now living, right, in a place that is safe, that's clean, that has some permanency, right? But also helps to work with the various idiosyncrasies that would mean that these people would be houseless to begin with, right? Mm. Idiosyncrasies like these are some people who actually can't live with other people. Some people whose characteristics would mean that only in a houseless community would people think that they're normal, right? Idiosyncrasies like that, or people who are struggling about this or that, right? Or people who have too many people who want to live together that no regular house landlord would allow them to live together. So, like the 15 Micronesians can live together, and by the way, all of their combined income would make that possible. It's just that no landlord would allow 15 people to live in one house, right? And so now they would do together. But to do that, they had to hack it, right? So it's not like totally separate, but hack it. And hacking requires humans who would be willing to do that. Somebody in government who would go, oh, that's really interesting. Let's figure out a way, right? So it's neither inside or outside, it's in the in-between space.
Yeah, and I think to make that happen, you have to have a government that's more responsive to actual people's needs. And right now,
Yes.
I think one of the problems is it's just governed by money. And there's too much money in politics. I mean, this is nothing that you won't read in every newspaper. But the fact that it hasn't been responsible to real people and real people's needs is why it's been hacked in a bad way now, I think. And it's
Yes.
It's in crisis, and it's foundering. So we need to get better hacks.
We need to get better hacks and also recognize that right now, because people with good intentions are getting removed from government, that we have a phenomena that I'm beginning to think of as useful government expertise that are now being held by refugees. They're like government refugees, right? But they're no longer able to be there, but they have all kinds of knowledge about how it is that these things might be able to be brought together.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you for coming tonight. My question is about ideas and metaphors. You mentioned Indra's net, and there's the Zen koan tradition. So we're taking some of these metaphors from a different time, a different place, a different culture, and I think that they can be very useful, but sometimes it might be hard to, say, convince the wider public of, like, oh, there's this great idea about how we're all interconnected if it doesn't kind of come from within. My question is, what kind of new metaphors maybe that we could create, or how can we maybe translate some of these Buddhist metaphors from a different time and place in a way that might work effectively to resonate in a culture in this time of crisis? Thanks.
So you happen to be talking to a wild variant, right? So I don't use the ancient ones because I know that they would have been relevant in that time place, but not so relevant now. And so there are new ways, but also an interesting thing, both in indigenous and Zen is interesting because I think of Zen as almost being has indigenous roots because of the way in which Buddhism and the Tao, right, were brought together. So I think of it as being more indigenous than not. So what's useful is to understand that they were not metaphors for the people of that time. They were examples of direct experiences, okay, that would be described in a certain way. And so when I say to people, for example, you need to flow as swiftly as the river, I'm not talking about that as a metaphor. I'm saying go to the river and watch how fast it moves, okay? And when you see how fast it moves, that's how fast I want you to let go of your problem, right? So I'm not talking about it like as a metaphor, but actually as an experiential example. So what I have found more useful today is stories rather than metaphors. So if I tell the story about what happened after the Lahaina fire for the community where the people of Molokai crossed the channel in their boats and were the first to arrive because they saw the fires on the horizon. And the communities in Molokai where there's more than 15% unemployment, they just took things out of their closet and out of their freezer and the dried fish off of the line, and they just put it in the boat and they just crossed over. Because even if they didn't specifically know specific people in Lahaina, those were nonetheless their people, and they just went there, right? And so in this day and age, I think story is actually like a more useful thing to say to people, and to understand that what story is it should be like the example, not the exemplar. In other words, oh, it happened there, it can't happen anywhere else. No, it happened with those people. How did they do it? And we can be those people too, right? We can be those people too. Yeah, I am a renegade Zen Buddhist. I don't give koans to my students, for example, which puts me in some controversy in the world, but only in certain worlds.
Yeah. The way I've described that process in something that I wrote is that cultures have certain magnets that draw things from other cultures, and I think that's a process that's happened as Buddhism has come into the West. It hasn't come as a whole tradition necessarily, and when immigrants come to the West, they bring what's important to them, and they try to keep that going, and that's a certain, and they try to adapt it to the new culture. When non-immigrants adopt a tradition like Buddhism, there are certain sort of cultural magnets that are already there. In China, centuries ago, it was Taoism, Confucianism, the indigenous traditions that were there, and they sort of drew out certain aspects of the Buddhist tradition that were going to work with those traditions, and then new things. That's how Zen and other traditions sort of emerged as something new, as a new articulation. So the indigenous traditions, I think, in the modern West are things like psychology and science and Emerson's transcendentalism and romanticism, and there are all those kind of magnets draw out certain aspects of Buddhism and then sort of mix together and make a new articulation of the tradition. And so I think that happens kind of naturally, but people are also doing this in response to particular crises and particular needs that communities and the world has at this particular time. Sometimes it's misguided, and sometimes it works out very well. But it's not always a very conscious process. It's a kind of slow-moving cultural process.
Thank you. I wonder if you would speak with us a little bit about the pain that humans feel when they're witnessing collapse, and practices from indigenous traditions or from Buddhism, collective or individual, that can move that pain in ways that can bring us into community.
Yeah. So one of the unique aspects of Buddhism actually is that its origin was about the inquiry of suffering, right? And so we actually do have practices within Buddhism that is about not burying the suffering or covering it over, but essentially putting it in an appropriate place within us that would allow us not to add additional burden to the suffering, right? Additional burden. So there's the pain that you might have, and then there is the way in which that pain can be further magnified because you continue to pick at it and make it bigger than it normally is. The example that I use in the classroom this morning, okay, is the day before I came on this trip, I happened to have a close encounter with a corner of a piece of furniture and my head. Okay, now I can tell the story that the furniture like leaped out and hit me, but that's not the case, right? It involved a cat, something that fell on the floor, a piece of furniture, and moving too suddenly. And I really hit my head hard. I hit it so hard that within less than 20 minutes, it was as big as like a golf ball, basically here. Okay, I could tell though that it wasn't concussive. So I didn't feel dizzy. I didn't have those kinds of things, and so I knew it wasn't a concussive thing. But it sure was big, and it sure looked bad. And and so then I did the thing, right? Ice on 20, ice off, ice on, ice off, ice on, ice off, right? I'm happy with that type of ice. Ice on, ice off, ice on, ice off. Right, okay, and I basically did that. Now, there are all kinds of ways in which, and by the way, it was like, it was immediately dramatic, and then over the next few days, there was even more drama, because I hit it here where there's nothing but bone, then whatever happened internally has to drain. And it won't drain like into the bone. So it drains down into the cavity here. And so therefore I ended up having like a large black and blue bruise and a little bit of a red vein line. And then it continued to move over the course of the days because it continues to drain down, right? And then of course then it turns a little purple and it turns yellow, and and it's very dramatic. It's very dramatic. Okay, now it's very dramatic looking, but I could have added a lot to it by becoming very dramatic. Okay, I could have there was pain, but I could have added more suffering to that pain, right? By, having a long blaming conversation with the cat, right? Okay, or doing that, or panicking. How can I go on this trip when I look like this, right? Having a concern about my appearance like this, or trying desperately to put 4 or 5 sunscreen coverings on. Maybe the color in the sunscreen would mean that they can't see my blue or my yellow, right? Or when I talk to people to turn this way so that they don't notice that is what's the case. There's like all kinds of ways that I could have done that, and it would have lasted for days, right? As it is, there's still some discoloration. And so some people who are very observant, I could tell that they're interacting with me in a way in which they're either curious or concerned, right? They could be curious, or their concern could be, did Norma have a close encounter with a human that we need to know about so that we can keep Norma safe, right? They'll have that type of thing. And so then the question is, how do I discern about their suffering, right? And how can I be an agent in helping to interrupt that so that it's okay? That we're going to just normalize. We're going to normalize that, okay, I had an injury. Oh, and by the way, only if I directly rub it now do I actually feel some discomfort, okay? I do not yet know whether I will permanently have a perturbance because maybe the bone, went and did something, but I am not in discomfort. I'm not in active discomfort right now, right? So there's like a way that we practice, right, is not to cover it up, but to put it in its right relationship with all the things, So, in my 20s, I had chronic leukemia, right? And then at the same time, I was politically victorious. And then I lost a re-election by 11 votes. Okay, right? And and then this happened, and then that happened, And then I cared for both my mother and my father separately in their last days, right? When they were 68, my parents were divorced at 68. And then I got custody of my mother, right? And all these things, can happen, right? All these things can happen. And the aspect is, it's not about whether you tamp it down, but how do you navigate that? And also, give space and time to grieving. I think there's a way in which we have a story about how grief should occur, and we don't understand that it's almost energetic waves that will come through us, And so there's some times when I would feel like I would see a thing and it would bring up in me, right, a loss of people who have recently passed. And at that moment, I should pause. I should give it a moment. I should allow that memory, not only the memory of the loss, right? Because what happens is, if you don't give it its due, then you won't remember why you have a loss. You have a loss because there was something that was important not to lose, right? And so to be able to be filled with the experiential just sense of the great, the gratitude I feel, the wondrousness of that person, how that person was a jerk, but I forgave them, right? I mean, to have that, and to have that be able to just unfold in a few minutes is the practice, rather than to be trying to pull it out over days of time to figure out what the loss is. Just have it play itself almost as an internal movie that is just moving through you, right? So that in that loss, frequently, in grief, you will find a little bit of a smile on my face, because I would understand how important this loss is, right? This person, right? Or this thing that I helped to build that was torn down in the course of just a year, right? And I had put all my energy into that, and it's torn down now in the course of a year. And to stop to just have that sense, why it was important to do it in the first place. And to understand that anything that you do plants a seed. And that seed you may not cross over again, but someone else will. Someone else will take that seed and they will run with it. And they would be unable to run with it if you had not planted it. To have that perspective, right? To have that perspective, right? So.
We have time for one more question.
So could you just say maybe a little bit more about that when it comes to watching your civilization collapse?
Oh, okay. All right.
Because the temptation to panic could be quite great, I guess.
Yes. Yes. So let's say both. There are some things that have been said through time about you have to be able to see things for exactly as they are if you are to do anything about it. And when you see things for exactly they are, it's about seeing things that cannot be seen and hearing things that cannot be easily heard, so that you can understand things that you do not understand, right? So in other words, you have to actually not only be able to see it with just your opinion or your judgment, right? You have to kind of dig a little deep for that. Usefully, you don't have to dig it deep just by yourself. You can do this by group inquiry, which I believe is very useful when you see like whole systems and whole things collapse, is to do this in collective inquiry rather than individual inquiry. Because clearly as individuals, when you see so much collapsing there, you would feel, what can I do about it? And the answer is, you individually can't do much, but we can. Okay? All right, that's the formula. The formula is we can. If you're interested, I even have like the numbers of people that would need to do that. I have a little formula around that. Okay? But so there's seeing things for what they are, and then there's a thing that is the most difficult. And the most difficult is to accept that that's what's happening, rather than to deny that that's what's happening. The acceptance part is really important, and a way that I've come to better handle or manage or navigate acceptance is not to try to cast blame for why it's happening. Just to recognize the phenomena. It's collapsing, but not to try to cast blame, okay? There are any number of influencers and podcasters who would be able to cover that territory. I don't have to do that. That doesn't have to be my assignment, okay, all right? Okay, by the way, I'm a person who has a flip phone and nothing smarter than that. And I do that so I will be smart, okay? So it's like if I remove, I have many opinions and guesses as to why we have come to this place that are useful so that we don't replicate that, okay? But the part where the blame comes on is like energy that is like no better than the proverbial pissing in the wind. And if you piss in the wind and you don't duck, okay, the consequences are not metaphoric. Okay, all right, okay. So it's like that, so I try not to expend my energy in that direction, okay? And then there's like, oh, okay, if I hold this as a long journey that happened long before my earliest ancestor, and I cast I throw the Hail Mary, which I know happened many times, right? Like you could hear it in historical accounts. People who took a chance because what was happening right then, it wasn't going to happen. So they took a chance and they threw a Hail Mary. They wrote the subversive thing and then they hid it and they passed it secretly, okay? Or they invented that thing and they took a chance that somebody would see that it was brilliant, right? Or they, they planted seeds for trees that nobody knew would be useful, right? They took a shot. They threw a Hail Mary, okay? So then it's like, okay, to have a bigger perspective and then try to like come down to my assignment right now, okay? And in that, I know I'm going to be grieving, okay? I know that I'm going to have to make time for loss. I have to do that. And luckily, I'm in a reflective practice. And so what I know is that it would be normal for every day to have some grief, to have some hope, to have some time that would feel not useful, and for a time for it to be so energetic. I don't like put those into categories, right? And I make time for that. And I have actual physical practices for that, right? The most significant would be to not be breathing high and fast in me. And so to be breathing lower and to actually actually feel, not as a metaphor, the ground under my feet. Only wear shoes where I can feel the ground. Right? Only have like this way in which my center of gravity is low. Because being grounded is not a state of mind, it's a state of the body. And so if I am grounded as a state of my body, not as a state of my mind, I will be able to encounter more confusion that's going on. Because the confusion will not confuse me. It's just a roiling confusion. But I know my assignment. I know what I need to do. I know where I need to go. I know who I need to do it with. I know that I need to keep building the number of people I do it with. Okay? Right? That's something that somebody reminded me when I said to that person every week for 18 months, no, I do not believe in writing books. Okay? And they said, well, I know you have a formula. Will you get to that number of people if you have to meet them one by one? And I had to say, okay, that's rational. I can't do that, right? And so now I have to be in relationship to people that I have never met, right? Who will have an assignment and who will know which direction to go. And we'll go there. But you gotta make time for these ways in which many people have spent most of their lives actually working for things that are now very fragile. They're very fragile in terms of what they can do, in what they are. They're under attack all of the time, and I would say at some point, right, we have to lay it to rest and go farther ahead than the tight place so that as it collapses, there's actually things that we need, right? Actually things that we need. They're we know before we cannot feed anyone how to feed people. Before there's no shelter for anyone, we know how we're going to provide shelter for each other, right? Before our economy completely collapses, okay, that we know that, that economy that was so robust that half the people would not be able to make ends meet wasn't worth holding on together to begin with. But we have built the new thing, not just have a critique about the old thing, right? We would have built the new thing, not just have a critique about the old thing, right? Okay, and so there's so much practical doingness, right, that we would say, if we are to cry, we need to cry in the fields that we're planting. Okay? Have that kind of mentality. That the Chinese in me would basically say, that's the practical way to live, right? The practical way to live is a thing, right?
This concludes tonight's event. Please join me in thanking our speakers.
Thank you.